Father uncovers the horrifying truth behind his son's brutal murder. The phone call came at 3 a.m. A strange number flashed on the screen. He knew it wasn't anyone he knew. His heart raced. He answered. The voice on the other end was calm, but cold. "Your son. We need you to come." His hands trembled. "What happened?" he asked, his voice shaky. A pause. The voice spoke again. "We found him. He's gone." His throat tightened. "Found him?"
"Yes."
"Come to the police station."
"Now."
The line went dead. The man sat still, holding the phone. He couldn't process it. His mind was numb. His son gone? It didn't make sense. His son was fine just hours before. He tried to call his wife. No answer. His hands shook more. Panic spread through his chest. He jumped out of bed, ran to the door. The cool air hit him as he stepped outside. It smelled like rain, but the sky was clear. He didn't understand. His heart beat harder, louder. Every step to the car felt heavier. When he reached the police station, he could feel the cold creeping under his skin. It wasn't right. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He walked into the dimly lit room. A detective stood near the door. His face was unreadable. The man's breath caught in his throat. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The detective didn't reply at first, just motioned for him to follow. They led him down a narrow hallway. The walls were too white, too sterile. His footsteps echoed in the silence. He felt dizzy. A door opened ahead. A cold gust of air hit his face. The room was dark, except for the light above. On the table lay a body. His heart stopped. The shape was familiar. Too familiar. His son. But the face was almost unrecognizable. The skin was bruised, swollen. He couldn't breathe. He stepped forward, but his legs gave out. He knelt down. This couldn't be real. But it was. The detective stood back. "How?" The man choked out. The detective's gaze hardened. He was brutally murdered. A cold wave of terror washed over him. Brutally? His son? His mind refused to accept the words. What happened? The detective paused. Someone wanted him gone. Badly. The man's chest tightened. His son had been so young. Full of life. The detective's voice broke the silence. "We're still investigating. But who would do this?" The detective looked at him, and then at the body. Someone with a reason. The man's mind spun. 1,000 thoughts rushed through him. Who hated his son that much? Who wanted him dead? It couldn't be anyone he knew. But deep down, something felt wrong. A shadow loomed over his thoughts. He couldn't ignore the feeling. The detective turned to leave. The man stayed by his son. The truth gnawed at him. Who had done this? His eyes burned as they stayed locked on the lifeless body. The silence in the room was deafening. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't turn away. Something was off. His mind raced. The detective's words echoed in his head. Someone with a reason. But what reason could there be? His son had been kind, quiet, never involved in trouble. Why would anyone want him gone? The air felt thicker, heavier. A sense of dread settled over him like a dark cloud. He reached for his son's hand. Cold. Too cold. A chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, a voice from behind. "Sir, we need to talk." The detective was back, but his expression had changed. It was sharper now. More urgent. "What is it?" the man asked, his voice trembling. "We found something," the detective said, leading him away from the table. They walked to a back office. The man barely noticed the walls, the furniture. His mind was elsewhere. His son. What had happened? The detective handed him a small evidence bag. Inside, a torn piece of fabric. The fabric was dark, almost black, with a faint metallic glimmer. "What is this?" the man whispered. The detective took a deep breath. "It's from your son's jacket." The man's heart skipped a beat. His son had worn a jacket that night. But the fabric, it didn't make sense. The detective continued. "Here's the thing. We found blood in the alley near where we found him." The man's stomach churned. But the blood wasn't his son's. It was someone else's. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't fit. Someone attacked him there, the detective said, but it wasn't a random mugging. It was something personal. The man's mind raced. Personal. Who would hurt his son like this? He had to know. He needed to know. Do you have any leads? The man asked, desperate. The detective nodded slowly. We're looking into it. We have a few suspects.
Who? The man asked.
The detective hesitated, then spoke. Someone close to him. Someone he trusted. His blood ran cold. The room seemed to tilt. The man stumbled back. His son had trusted someone? Hadn't he told him everything? Who could have betrayed him like that? The detective's eyes were steady. We'll find them. But it didn't comfort him. Not one bit. The man's mind was spinning. His son betrayed? Who would do such a thing? The room felt suffocating now. He needed answers. His chest was tight, like he couldn't breathe. The detective stood silent, waiting for him to speak. But the man was lost. Who? He whispered, almost to himself. Who could have done this? The detective took a slow step forward. Someone who knew him well. Someone who had a motive. Motive. The word echoed in his head. His son had no enemies. Or at least, none that he knew of. The man's thoughts drifted back to the last time he saw his son. Just hours ago, everything had seemed so normal. A phone call. A quick goodbye. But now? Now it felt like a lifetime ago.
What are you saying? The man demanded.
Someone close to him, the detective repeated. The air around him seemed to grow colder. He had to know more. What does that mean? Who? The detective didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced down at the fabric in the evidence bag. His face was unreadable. It means we have reason to believe this wasn't a random act. The man's stomach tightened. The detective's eyes met his. Your son had a relationship with someone. Someone who might have been involved in something darker. Darker? His son. What had he been mixed up in? The detective looked away for a moment, almost as if weighing his next words. You didn't know about the debts, did you?
Debts.
The word hit like a slap to the face. What debts? The detective's gaze hardened. Your son owed someone money. Big money. His heart sank.
No.
His son wouldn't do that. He had always been careful, responsible. He would have told him, wouldn't he? But the detective was insistent. He was involved with the wrong people. People who don't let debts slide. The man's mind was in turmoil. How had he not known? How had his son hidden this from him? The detective paused. Your son's trust was used against him. Whoever this person is, they made sure he couldn't escape. The room seemed to spin around him. The walls were closing in. A flood of guilt rushed through him. He hadn't seen the signs. He hadn't asked the right questions. The detective's voice broke through his thoughts. We think we know who might have been involved. His pulse quickened.
Who? He demanded.
The detective's eyes darkened. A name is coming up again and again. Someone from your son's past. Someone who was dangerous. The man's hands shook. Dangerous. Who could be so dangerous that his son would feel trapped? The detective stood, his face grim. We'll need to talk to them. But it's not going to be easy. The man's breath caught in his throat. He had to find out the truth. For his son. The man's thoughts were a blur. He couldn't focus. Every part of him screamed for answers. His son.
Trapped.
The word echoed in his mind. Who? He whispered again. The detective paused, his eyes narrowing. Someone named Victor Grayson. The name hit like a punch to the gut. Victor Grayson.
He knew the name, but not well.
Just enough. A shady figure from his son's past. Someone who had been around for a while, but always just at the edges. Never fully part of the family, but always there. How do you know him? The detective asked, sensing the shift in the man's expression. He could barely find his voice.
I don't know, the man stammered.
Victor Grayson was involved with my son? The detective's eyes remained steady.
He might have been.
We've found traces of him around your son's last known location. The man's heart pounded in his chest. Victor. What had he done to his son? Why would my son get involved with him? The detective didn't answer right away. He only stared at the man, as if weighing something. Victor Grayson has a reputation, the detective said finally. A reputation for what? violence, deception, and a deep network of people who owe him. The man felt dizzy. His son had been involved with that? His son, who had always been cautious, careful. How could he have fallen into something like this? The detective's voice lowered. We think Victor is the one who pushed your son too far. The room grew darker. His pulse raced. Victor. The name burned in his mind. He needed to see this man. He needed to understand. What now? The man asked, his voice shaky. The detective nodded. We're going after him. We think he's hiding somewhere nearby. But we need your help. How? The detective stepped closer. We need to know everything you can about your son's connection to him. Who else might be involved? Any details, anything that might lead us to him? The man's mind raced. He was shaking. His son had been caught in something dark. The truth was slipping through his fingers like sand. He needed to know more. The detective placed a hand on his shoulder. Do you know where to start? The man nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on the ground. Victor Grayson. The name felt like poison. How could his son have gotten tangled up with him? But he knew. He had to find him. He had to face the truth, no matter how painful. Let's go, he said, his voice firm now. The detective gave him a sharp nod. They left the station in silence. The streets outside were empty, cold. The man's breath fogged in the air. His thoughts were darker now, consumed by questions. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. He would find Victor Grayson. And when he did, he would make him pay. The car ride was long and silent. The man's mind buzzed with questions. Victor Grayson. Why had his son gotten involved with him? What had happened between them? He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. The detective drove with purpose, his face tense. The man could feel the tension in the air. Every passing streetlight seemed to intensify his anxiety. It felt like they were moving in slow motion, yet the urgency was suffocating. The detective glanced at him, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. You're sure about this? The man nodded. I have to know. The detective didn't say anything more. They turned onto a dark, narrow street, the kind the man had never noticed before. It was quiet here. Too quiet. The air felt thick with unease. They stopped in front of an old, run-down building. Its windows were shattered, the walls cracked and stained. Victor's hideout. The man's heart thudded loudly in his chest. He didn't want to step out of the car, but he knew he had to. The detective got out first, moving quickly but cautiously. The man followed, his legs unsteady. He could feel the weight of every step he took. They reached the door. The detective pushed it open slowly. Inside, the building was abandoned, the walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. It reeked of mildew and rot. The floorboards creaked underfoot as they moved deeper into the darkness. They reached a hallway. A single light flickered overhead. The detective motioned for the man to follow him. Each step felt heavier. His senses were on high alert. The smell of something burning lingered in the air. Suddenly, a door at the end of the hallway creaked open. A figure stepped into the light. Victor Grayson. The man's blood ran cold. He looked different than he remembered. His hair was longer, his face gaunter. But his eyes. The same cold, empty eyes. Victor grinned. Did you come to make things right? The man's throat went dry. Where is my son? Victor laughed, low and dark. You really think you're going to get answers from me? The man's fists clenched. He took a step forward. You'll tell me where he is. Victor raised his hands in mock surrender. I don't know what you're talking about. But his eyes flickered, betraying him. The man lunged. Before he could reach him, the detective grabbed his arm. Don't, the detective hissed. Victor smirked, watching them struggle. You think you can intimidate me? He asked. The man was breathing heavily now, his anger boiling over. Victor's smile faltered. Look, you don't want to do this. You have no idea who you're messing with. The man's vision blurred with rage. You murdered my son, he spat. Victor's grin disappeared. There was a tense silence. Then, finally, Victor spoke. He wasn't supposed to die. The words hung in the air. The man's heart stopped. What do you mean? He asked, his voice shaking. Victor's gaze hardened. He got in over his head. I tried to warn him, but he didn't listen. The detective stepped forward. Warn him about what? Victor's eyes flickered to the door behind them. I told him to stay out of it. But he wouldn't. He wanted in on the money. The man's mind raced. Money? His son? What had he gotten involved in? Victor sneered. Your son got mixed up with the wrong people. People who don't forgive. The man felt like he was going to collapse. His son. Had he really been involved in something so dangerous? Victor stepped back. Get out of here. While you still can. The man's fists were trembling. He wanted to strike him. But he didn't. Not yet. Where is he? The man asked again, his voice barely a whisper. Victor's smile returned, cold and mocking. I already told you.
He's gone.
There's nothing you can do. The detective's grip on the man's arm tightened. Let's go, he said, his voice firm. The man didn't move. Victor's words echoed in his mind. He's gone. His son. The man couldn't process it. His son wasn't supposed to die. Not like this. Not from something so twisted. But as he turned to leave, he saw something on the floor. A small piece of paper. He picked it up. The detective didn't notice. It was a note. In his son's handwriting. The words were simple. Asterisk, I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean for this to happen. Asterisk. The man's world crumbled. The note trembled in his hands. His son's handwriting. I'm sorry, Dad. The words burned into his soul. His heart ached with every syllable. He felt dizzy. The room seemed to spin. The detective turned back, catching the note in the man's hand. What is it? The man's voice was hoarse. I need to read this. The detective stepped closer, his eyes scanning the paper. His expression softened, but only for a moment. He understood. They both knew what this meant. His son had been caught in something deep. And now it was too late. The note was a final confession. A plea for forgiveness. The man's chest tightened. I didn't know, he muttered to himself, barely audible. He hadn't known his son had been involved in anything so dangerous. But now, it was all coming to light. His son's secret life. The debts. The danger. Victor Grayson had been just the tip of the iceberg. The detective cleared his throat, his tone firm. We need to get out of here. The man couldn't speak. He folded the note and put it in his pocket, trying to steady himself. Victor's mocking grin flashed in his mind. You think you can just walk away from this? The words replayed, each one like a nail in his chest. Let's go, the detective said again, his voice pushing through the fog of disbelief. The man didn't argue. They left the building without another word, stepping into the cold night. The streets were empty, the darkness pressing down on them. His mind was a mess of questions, guilt, and confusion. The note. What did it really mean? What had his son been involved in? Victor Grayson was only a part of it. The detective drove in silence, eyes fixed on the road. Where are we going? The man asked, his voice barely a whisper. The detective's jaw clenched. We have to find out who else was involved. Who your son owed, and why. The man nodded, though he could barely hold on to his thoughts. His son,
dead.
Involved in something dark. The truth was slipping through his fingers. They reached another part of town. This time, the detective parked in front of a dimly lit building. We have a lead, he said quietly. The man looked at him, eyes wide. Another one? The detective nodded. I think we're getting closer. The man's breath caught. Closer? To what? To the truth? To the people who had destroyed his son's life? Let's go, he said, his voice trembling with urgency. They stepped out of the car, walking toward the building. The man could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. This was it. The answers were just beyond the door. But as they reached the entrance, something shifted. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He froze, suddenly aware of the shadow lurking just beyond the edge of a streetlight. The detective turned sharply, his hand moving toward his weapon. The man could hear his heartbeat in his throat. Someone was watching them. A figure emerged from the shadows. A familiar face. The man's breath caught. It was someone he never expected to see. Someone from his son's life. someone who had always been a stranger to him. Victor's not the only one you need to worry about, the figure said, voice low and menacing. The man's stomach dropped. The detective stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Who are you? The figure grinned. You're not ready for the truth. But it's coming. And you won't like what you find. The man's blood ran cold. Who was this? Who else had been involved in his son's life and death? The figure stepped closer, his face partially obscured by the darkness. The man's instinct screamed at him to move, to run. But he stood frozen, heart pounding in his chest. The detective's hand was still on his gun, ready for anything. Who are you? The man repeated, his voice shaking, barely above a whisper. The figure chuckled softly. You really don't know, do you? The man's mind raced. Every word, every movement seemed to carry a deeper meaning. What do you want? The detective asked, his voice sharp, cautious. The figure's eyes glinted in the dim light. I think you both need to understand something before you dig too deep, he said, his tone cold, almost mocking. The man's stomach churned. I'm warning you, the detective said, stepping forward. The figure raised his hand, signaling for him to stop. I'm not here to fight, the figure said. He took a step back into the shadows, but his voice remained clear. I'm here to give you a choice. The man blinked, confused. A choice? Yes, the figure continued. You can walk away from all this. From the truth, the danger, everything. The man's mind reeled. Walk away? How could he walk away when his son was dead? Or, the detective pressed, his voice low. The figure smirked. Or you can keep digging. Keep chasing answers that you're not ready for. Answers that will destroy everything you thought you knew. The man felt a cold shiver run down his spine. His son's death had been horrible enough. Now, there were more forces at play, darker forces than he could have imagined. He swallowed hard. You think I'll stop, he said, voice raw. The figure paused, then gave a small, humorless laugh. You might, but I'm guessing you won't. The figure reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, black envelope. He tossed it at the man's feet. The man's hand shook as he picked it up. The envelope was sealed with a symbol he didn't recognize. His heart raced. Open it, the figure said, turning away. You'll understand everything. The detective moved quickly, grabbing the man's arm before he could tear it open. Wait, the detective warned. This could be a trap. The figure turned, his face barely visible in the shadows. You've already walked into a trap, he said, his voice chilling. And you don't even realize it yet. The detective stepped back, his eyes scanning the figure one last time. Who are you working for? The detective asked, his voice firm. The figure smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Does it matter? He asked. And then, without another word, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving the man and the detective standing in the cold night. The man's breath hitched. The envelope was still in his hand. His fingers trembled as he stared at the symbol on the seal. Should we open it? The detective asked. The man didn't answer at first. He didn't know if he was ready to face whatever was inside. But he had no choice. His son's death, everything, was tied to this. He ripped the envelope open with shaking hands. Inside was a single piece of paper, covered in dark, jagged writing. The words were clear but unsettling. Asterisk, this is just the beginning. There are those who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Your son knew too much. And now so do you? Asterisk. The man's mind exploded with confusion. His son had known something. Something dangerous. But what? The note continued. Asterisk, find the man in the suit. He's the key. Asterisk. The detective's eyes met the man's. Who's the man in the suit? The man swallowed hard. He had no idea. But he knew one thing. The answers he was looking for weren't just in the past. They were in the future. And whatever he found next, it would change everything. The man's mind was racing. The note burned in his hands. Asterisk, find the man in the suit. He's the key. Asterisk. Who was this man? What did he know? The words echoed in his head, each one more menacing than the last. The detective was pacing now, eyes narrowed. I don't like this, he muttered. We're being played. The man looked up, his gaze hard. I don't care. What do you mean you don't care? The detective shot back. I'm going after this, the man said, his voice a low growl. I need to know the truth. About my son. About everything. The detective stopped in his tracks, eyeing him warily. Do you even know what you're asking for? You don't just walk into this. People get killed for less. The man swallowed the lump in his throat, trying to suppress the flood of fear. I'm not going to stop. The detective sighed, rubbing his face. Then let's do this right. We'll follow the trail. We'll find this man in the suit. The man nodded, determination hardening in his chest. But as they stepped into the car and drove into the night, something felt off. A shift in the air. An unsettling feeling that something was watching them. Every street corner, every shadow seemed to hold something dangerous. The man's grip on the envelope tightened. They were getting closer. He could feel it. His son's death wasn't a random act. It was calculated. And whoever was behind it was still out there. He had to know who they were. The detective pulled the car into a quiet, dimly lit street. Do you think the man in the suit is here? The man asked, his voice hoarse. The detective didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the street carefully, his eyes darting from window to window. No sign of him yet, the detective said, his voice tense. But I don't like this place. The man's heart rate spiked. His instincts were screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't.
Not now.
The detective opened the door slowly, glancing both ways before stepping out. The man followed, his body stiff with anticipation. They walked toward a small building in the distance, its windows dim, the door locked and guarded. Something wasn't right. The detective's eyes met the man's. This is it, he said quietly. The man in the suit could be inside. The man's stomach twisted. Everything in him screamed to stop, but he pushed it down. He had come too far. They approached the door cautiously. The detective knocked twice. A brief silence. Then, the door cracked open. A man in a dark suit stood in the doorway, his face calm, unreadable. Who are you? He asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. The man's eyes locked onto the man in the suit. I'm here for answers, he said, his voice low and steady. The man in the suit didn't blink. Answers come at a price, he said, his tone suddenly cold. You should know that. The detective stepped forward, his hand on his weapon. We're not here for games. The man in the suit's lips twitched into a slight smile. Then you're wasting your time, he said. The answers you seek are far more dangerous than you can imagine. The man's blood ran cold. He could feel the weight of the words, heavy in the air. He had to know. Tell me what happened to my son, he demanded, his voice sharp now. The man in the suit's expression remained unchanged. Your son got involved in something bigger than you can understand, he said softly. And now you're tangled up in it too. The man's vision blurred, his mind swirling with the implication of those words. Bigger than he could understand? He didn't care about the danger. He needed to know what had happened. I'm not leaving until you tell me everything, the man said, his voice hoarse with desperation. The man in the suit stepped aside, allowing them inside. The room was sparse, dark. Shadows clung to the corners. But there was something else. A sense of power, of control. Sit down, the man in the suit said, his voice almost a command. The man didn't hesitate. He sat. The detective stood behind him, eyes scanning the room. The man in the suit locked the door behind them. He turned, his face still unreadable. Your son was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. The man's heart clenched. What do you mean? The man in the suit smiled, a thin, knowing smile. It's simple. Your son uncovered something. Something that people were willing to kill for. The man's hands shook. What was it? The man in the suit's eyes gleamed, dark with secrets. It's not just about your son anymore. The room seemed to close in. The truth was slipping closer, but it felt more dangerous than ever. The man's pulse quickened. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It's not just about your son anymore. The man in the suit's eyes glinted, cold as steel. The room felt smaller, the shadows deeper. The walls seemed to close in on him. He leaned forward, his voice trembling with desperation. "What does that mean? What are you talking about?" The man in the suit smiled, a thin, calculating curve of his lips. "You're too late," he said softly. "The pieces are already in motion." The word stung. What pieces? The man's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. "Who's behind this?" he demanded, his voice raw. The man in the suit didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to a dark, wooden cabinet in the corner, opening it slowly. He pulled out a small, silver box, placing it on the table in front of the man. The box gleamed under the dim light, almost unnatural. A chill ran down the man's spine. "What's that?" he asked, unable to keep the tremor from his voice. "Everything you need to know is inside," the man in the suit said, his voice quieter now, almost too calm. The detective, still standing behind the man, shifted uneasily. The man reached for the box, hands shaking, his mind swirling with fear. He hesitated for just a moment. What if it was another trap? But there was no turning back now. He lifted the lid. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper, and beneath it, a photograph. He unfolded the paper first, his hands trembling as he read the words written in scrawled, hurried handwriting. Asterisk, the game has changed. Your son was just a pawn, and now you're next, asterisk. The room seemed to tilt, the air thickening around him. Next, the man whispered. The photograph. He picked it up slowly. His breath caught. It was a picture of his son. But behind him, in the background, a figure stood, half hidden in shadow. The face was obscured, but the posture was unmistakable. The man's throat tightened as he stared at the figure. It wasn't just anyone. It was the detective. His blood ran cold. What is this?" the man choked out. The detective's eyes widened as he glanced at the photograph. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. The man in the suit remained silent, his eyes gleaming with a dark satisfaction. "You've been asking the wrong questions," he said slowly. "The truth isn't just about who killed your son. It's about who's been pulling the strings all along." The man's thoughts were spinning. His gaze snapped to the detective. "Tell me this isn't true," he demanded, his voice trembling with the weight of his suspicion. The detective didn't answer immediately. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stood there, silent. The man's heart pounded louder with each passing second. The detective's face remained neutral, but his eyes. The man could see it. The flicker of something. Fear. Regret? The truth? Finally, the detective spoke, his voice low and filled with a sense of dread. "You need to understand something." The man's breath quickened. "What do I need to understand?" The detective stepped closer, his hand gripping the edge of the table. "I didn't want this," he said, his words barely a whisper. "I didn't want any of this." The man's head swam. The detective's confession. It didn't make sense. Why would he have been involved with his son's death? The man's heart pounded. He felt a coldness creeping through his veins. The detective continued, his voice strained. "Your son, he knew too much. He was going to expose things. Things that would have destroyed everything." The man's eyes widened, his pulse racing. "Expose what?" The detective took a deep breath, then finally met the man's gaze. "The organization your son got involved with, they're bigger than you can imagine. They control everything. And I was working for them. I didn't have a choice." The words hit the man like a physical blow. His knees felt weak, and the room spun. The detective, the one man he had trusted to help him, was part of the very thing that had torn his life apart. "I was trying to protect you," the detective continued, voice cracking. "I tried to warn your son, but he wouldn't listen. He kept digging. He wouldn't stop. He was going to blow the whole thing wide open. They couldn't let that happen." The man felt sick to his stomach. He had been so close to the truth. And now the truth felt like a weight he couldn't bear. The detective's eyes were pleading now, his hands shaking. "I never wanted him to die. I never wanted any of this." The man stood up abruptly, his body trembling with rage. He could barely breathe, his chest tightening. "You knew," he spat. "You knew, and you didn't stop it." The detective stepped back, hands raised in surrender. "I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry," he muttered. But the man couldn't hear it anymore. The truth had destroyed everything. His son was gone, and nothing would ever bring him back. The man's heart raced, his mind a blur of fury and disbelief. The room felt like it was suffocating him. He couldn't breathe. Everything he thought he knew had crumbled in an instant. The detective, the one person he had trusted, had betrayed him. "Why didn't you tell me?" the man hissed, his voice raw with rage. The detective's eyes were filled with remorse, but it wasn't enough. "I couldn't," he said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't risk it. If I told you, they would have come for you too." "Who?" the man demanded, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "The people behind this, behind your son's death. It's not just one person. It's an entire network. Powerful, untouchable." The man's blood ran cold as the words sank in. Your son was getting too close. He started digging into things he wasn't supposed to. They couldn't let him live after that. The man felt a wave of nausea wash over him. His son had been murdered because he'd learned too much? "Tell me everything," he growled, his voice trembling with the weight of his grief. The detective swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the box on the table. "The photo, the note, it's all part of it. Your son had started to piece together something huge. He didn't realize how dangerous it was. He was just looking for answers, and they saw him as a threat. When you started looking into it too..." The detective's words trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. The man's head spun. "Is that why you came to me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You wanted to keep me away from the truth? To protect yourself?" The detective didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than any words ever could. But the man couldn't let this go. "Who do I trust now?" he whispered, more to himself than to the detective. The man in the suit. The game was bigger than he'd ever imagined. Who could he trust in a world so corrupted? He could feel his anger rising like a storm inside him, threatening to consume him whole. But a part of him knew he had to keep going. He had to finish this for his son. He turned toward the detective, his voice hard and determined. "Where do I find them?" The detective looked at him, his eyes haunted. "You really want to know?" The man nodded, his jaw set. "Yes." The detective hesitated, his face drawn. "They're not just in this city. They're everywhere. And they don't make mistakes. You'll be marked from the moment you try to go after them." The man didn't flinch. "I'm already marked." The detective shook his head slowly. "You don't understand the power they have. If you go after them, it won't just be you at risk. It's everyone you care about. They'll come after everyone in your life." The man's mind raced. His son's death had been part of this game. But now, it was his turn to play. "I don't care anymore," the man said through gritted teeth. The detective's face softened with regret. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. But the man was already walking toward the door, his footsteps heavy with finality. "I'm already in too deep," he muttered, his voice filled with resolve. "I'm going to finish what my son started." The detective didn't try to stop him. He didn't say another word. The man stepped out into the night, his mind clear now. There was no going back. No turning away. He was going after the people who had taken his son, and he would stop at nothing to make them pay. The cold air hit his face, sharp and biting, as he made his way down the dark street. His thoughts were a blur, but one thing was crystal clear. He would get to the bottom of this. And no one, nothing, would stand in his way. The night seemed to swallow him whole as he moved through the empty streets. His footsteps echoed off the concrete, too loud in the oppressive silence. He felt the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. Every shadow, every distant sound, felt like a threat. The man's heart was pounding, adrenaline rushing through his veins. He didn't know where to start. He didn't know who to trust anymore. But one thing was clear, he had to keep moving. He couldn't let his son's death be in vain. The photograph, the note, he could still see them in his mind. The haunting words burned into his memory. Asterisk, your son knew too much. And now, so do you, asterisk. The figure in the suit had been right. Once you knew too much, there was no turning back. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the only number that might give him a lead. The detective had warned him that there were forces bigger than anything he could imagine. But it didn't matter anymore.
He was already in it.
The phone rang 3 times before the line picked up.
Yeah.
The voice was low, gruff, one he hadn't heard in years. Max, the man said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. I need your help. There was a long pause on the other end. Help with what? Max asked cautiously. I need to know everything about a man in a suit, the man said, trying to keep his voice calm, measured. Max was silent for a long moment, as if weighing the request. You're asking for trouble, he finally replied. You know that, right? I don't care, the man snapped. Max sighed, clearly not surprised. You're already too deep, he muttered. I'll dig into it. But you need to stay out of sight. Whoever these people are, they don't forget. And they don't let go. I'm not backing down, the man said firmly. Fine, Max replied, sounding resigned. But don't say I didn't warn you. The line went dead, and the man slipped his phone back into his pocket. His next move was clear. Find the man in the suit. Find whoever was behind all of this. He had to finish what his son had started. As he turned the corner, the city stretched out before him, cold and indifferent. He didn't know how much time he had left. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Every street, every building, seemed like it could hide something dangerous, something sinister. His eyes scanned the streets, every face he passed a potential threat. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching him. The man in the suit. Who was he? And why had he been involved with his son? The answers felt just out of reach, but he couldn't stop now. Every instinct told him he was close. He felt it in his gut. The pieces were finally falling into place. But as he moved deeper into the city, a strange feeling settled over him. Something was wrong. He turned down an alley, feeling the weight of the night closing in on him. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a man, dressed in black, his face partially obscured by a hood. The man stopped, instinctively reaching for his phone, but before he could react, the stranger spoke. You're looking for something you don't want to find, the man said, his voice low, almost a whisper. The words sent a chill down the man's spine. I'm not afraid of you, the man said, his voice steady. The stranger's eyes gleamed from the darkness. I'm not here to hurt you, he said. But you should know that the deeper you dig, the more you'll lose. The man took a step forward, his pulse quickening. I'm not turning back, he said, his voice unwavering. The stranger seemed to consider this for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. You'll need this. He stepped forward and handed the man a small, black envelope. The man stared at it, his hands instinctively reaching for it. The stranger turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving the man standing alone. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, and for a moment, he hesitated. But curiosity won out. He tore it open, revealing another note, this one even more cryptic than the last. Asterisk, the man in the suit is not who he seems. Trust no one, and keep your eyes open. They're closer than you think, asterisk. The man's heart pounded in his chest. The message was clear. The game had changed. And now he was no longer just looking for answers. He was being hunted. The city felt colder, darker now. Every corner seemed to hold a threat, every shadow a secret. The man shoved the note into his pocket and looked around, his senses on high alert. Someone was watching. He could feel it. And he knew one thing for sure, he was getting closer. Closer to the truth. And closer to whatever they would do to stop him. The air felt heavier now, charged with something dangerous, something unseen. The man glanced over his shoulder, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him, tracking his every movement. The alley seemed longer now, darker. The shadows twisted, as if alive. Every step he took echoed louder in the silence. He quickened his pace, instinct pulling him forward. The man couldn't afford to slow down. His heart pounded, each beat a reminder of everything he had lost. He had to keep moving, keep searching for answers, even if it meant walking straight into danger. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't need to look at it to know who it was. Max. He pulled a phone out and answered quickly. Did you find anything? The man's voice was low, strained. Max's voice was tense on the other end. I've got something. But you're not going to like it. The man's stomach dropped. Tell me. There was a pause. Max spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing his words. I tracked down the man in the suit. His name isn't just a name. It's an alias. He's part of something much bigger. This isn't just about your son anymore. The man's pulse quickened. What is it? Max's voice dropped even lower, barely a whisper now. They've been watching you. Since the day you started asking questions. They know everything about you. The man's hand clenched around the phone, his knuckles turning white. They've been manipulating you. All of it. Your son's death, your investigation. It's all part of a much larger game. What game? The man demanded. Max's voice was barely audible now. One you don't want to play. Get out of there. Now. The line went dead. The man stared at the phone for a long moment, his mind racing. He knew deep down that it was already too late. He had crossed the line. There was no going back. His son's death wasn't a random act of violence. It was a calculated move in a much larger scheme. And now, it seemed, he was the next pawn in their game. But he wasn't going to back down. He would never back down. He gripped the envelope tighter in his hand, the weight of it a stark reminder of how close he was to the truth. But the truth wasn't just about the man in the suit anymore. It was bigger, much bigger. And the more he dug, the more dangerous it became. The city stretched out before him, a dark maze of streets and alleys. He had no clear direction. But the feeling, that sense of being watched, grew stronger with every passing second. He wasn't just being hunted. He was being herded, led somewhere by unseen hands. The man turned sharply, his instincts screaming at him. He didn't know why, but something told him he wasn't alone. A car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the street. He caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the shadows just ahead. It was the same figure from earlier, the one who had handed him the envelope. The man's pulse surged. He moved faster, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had to catch up to him, had to get answers. The figure didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him. But the man was sure he was being led. Each step felt like it was taking him deeper into a web of secrets, lies, and danger. He pushed forward, his body taut with anticipation. And then, the figure turned the corner. The man quickened his pace, rounding the corner just in time to see the figure disappear through a narrow door in the side of a building. Without thinking, he ran toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. It was locked. He didn't hesitate. He stepped back and kicked the door hard, the wood splintering under the force. The door flew open. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by a single flickering bulb. The figure stood near the back of the room, waiting. And this time, the man could see his face. It wasn't a face he recognized, but something about it was familiar. The man stepped inside, his heart racing. I'm not going to ask again, he said, his voice low and steady. Tell me everything. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. Everything has a cost, he said, his voice cold and detached. The man's eyes narrowed. Who are you? The figure smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was something darker. You already know. The man's stomach twisted. No, I don't. The figure took a step forward, his eyes cold as ice. Your son found out the truth. And now you're next. The man felt the weight of those words sink into him. He was being pulled deeper into something he couldn't escape. The game had already started. And he had no idea how it would end. The words echoed in the man's mind like a death sentence. He had been right all along. This wasn't just about his son. It was bigger. Much bigger. The man's gaze never left the figure, who remained eerily calm, his expression unreadable. You think you can stop this? The man asked, his voice tightening with anger. The figure's lips curled into a twisted grin. It's already too late for you. You should have stopped digging. The man felt a chill crawl up his spine. Too late? What did that mean? He stepped forward, fists clenched, every muscle in his body tense. Tell me what's going on. Who are you working for? The figure didn't flinch. You think you can take down the people behind this? You can't. No one can. The man's thoughts raced. His son had uncovered something. He had been getting closer to the truth, but now the figure in front of him was confirming it. The man's mind was filled with flashes, his son's last days, the strange behavior, the cryptic warnings. His son had known, had understood. The man's pulse thudded in his ears. He was standing at the precipice now. There was no going back. Who are you? He demanded again, the desperation in his voice growing. The figure stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. I'm the one who told your son to stop. To leave it all alone. The words hit the man like a punch. Wait, his voice cracked. You knew my son? The figure said nothing, his gaze cold. The man's mind reeled. What was this person? What was his connection to his son? Why did you do it? The man whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. The figure stepped forward again. This time his voice was low, almost sympathetic. You don't understand, do you? You're not supposed to know. The man's stomach twisted. Know what? The figure paused, eyes gleaming with something dark. That your son was never meant to survive. A surge of nausea flooded the man's body, and he staggered backward.
What?
He was always expendable, the figure said flatly, his voice devoid of any emotion. Just like you will be. The man felt the walls closing in. This couldn't be happening. His son had been killed to keep a secret buried, a secret that was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The figure's words played over and over in his mind like a haunting refrain. Expendable. His son. Had he been nothing more than a pawn? He gripped the edges of the doorframe for support, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I won't stop, he said through gritted teeth. I won't let this go. The figure didn't answer. He just watched the man, as though waiting for him to finally understand the truth. You can't escape, the figure finally said, his voice calm but final. This isn't just a matter of running away. You're in this now. You won't make it out alive. The man felt his stomach churn. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, suffocating. The weight of everything was crashing down on him. But he didn't care. He couldn't care anymore. His son was dead. The detective had betrayed him. Now there was only one thing left to do. He was going to finish it. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to take down whoever was behind this. The figure stared at him for a long moment, as if measuring his resolve. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and almost mocking. Do you really think you can take on an organization that spans continents? The man's heart raced as he squared his shoulders. Yes, he said, his voice steady. I'm not afraid of you. The figure gave a short, humorless laugh. You should be. Then, with a final glance, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, his figure melting into the dark corners of the room. The man stood there, the words hanging in the air. The silence stretched on. He knew what had to be done. And now he was more determined than ever. Whoever they were, whatever they were capable of, he would bring them down. For his son. He would find the answers, and no one, nothing, would stand in his way. The door slammed shut behind the man, echoing through the dark room. The figure was gone, but his words lingered like a toxic cloud. You should be afraid. The man shook his head, trying to dispel the fear clawing at his insides.
No.
He wasn't afraid. He couldn't afford to be. For too long, he had lived in the shadow of his son's death, and now he had to face the truth. The truth that had been buried under layers of lies and deceit. He had to find the people behind this. He had to make them pay. The city outside felt colder than it ever had before, its streets dark and silent. Every corner seemed to hold some hidden danger. But it didn't matter. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. The man pulled his jacket tighter around himself, determined to press forward. He walked with purpose, his steps echoing as he moved down the narrow alley. His mind raced, pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together. The photograph, the cryptic note, the mysterious figure. It all pointed to one thing, the organization. A powerful, shadowy group that controlled everything from the shadows. But he couldn't understand why they had to kill his son. What had he found? And why hadn't they just erased the evidence instead? The questions gnawed at him, eating away at his resolve. But there was no time for answers, not yet. He needed to get to the bottom of this. He needed to find the source. As he turned another corner, he caught sight of a familiar face in the distance. A man in a suit. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be the man from earlier?
No.
This wasn't the same person. But it didn't matter. He had to know if this person was connected. With a surge of adrenaline, he quickened his pace. The man in the suit saw him and froze, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. Then, just as quickly, the stranger turned and walked briskly down the street. The man's instincts flared. Without hesitation, he chased after him, weaving through the crowd. He couldn't let him get away. He was getting closer now, so close he could almost reach out and grab him. But the man in the suit ducked into an alley, disappearing from view. The man cursed under his breath, pushing harder to catch up. The alley was dark and narrow, the walls towering above him, casting deep shadows. He rounded the corner, and he stopped dead in his tracks. The alley was empty, not a soul in sight. Just the quiet hum of the city behind him. A cold dread swept over him. How had he disappeared so quickly? He hadn't heard a door open or close. Had he been led into a trap? His senses screamed at him to turn around, to leave the alley, but something held him there. Something was wrong. A rustle behind him. He whipped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Nothing except the thick, oppressive silence that filled the alley. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Then he saw it. A shadow in the corner, just beyond his vision. It moved quickly, too quickly. And before he could react, a cold, metallic object pressed against the back of his neck. A gun. He froze. The voice that came next was calm, measured, as if the speaker had done this 1,000 times before. You shouldn't have come here. The man's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't seen the figure approach, hadn't heard a thing. A professional.
Who were they?
Who was behind this? The cold metal dug deeper into his skin.
He was trapped.
For the first time, he realized just how deep he had gotten into this. How much danger he was in. But even then, a part of him didn't care. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. Who are you? He demanded, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The figure didn't answer immediately. They just stood there, their breath slow and deliberate. You won't get the answers you're looking for, the voice said at last, low and threatening. Then why kill me? The man asked, barely able to hold onto his defiance. The figure exhaled sharply. We don't kill for no reason, the voice replied. But you're asking questions that could get a lot of people hurt. The man's mind raced. It was all about control, wasn't it?
Power.
Secrets. And he was threatening it all by digging too deep. The silence stretched on, each moment feeling like an eternity. And then, as if the decision had been made for him, the figure spoke again. Get out of here. Go home. The man's heart pounded. He couldn't believe it. Could this be it? Was he being let go? Why? He asked, voice shaking. Because you're not worth killing yet, the figure said coldly. With a final shove, the man stumbled forward, off balance. The gun was gone. And in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone too. The man stood there, shaken but alive. Alive but with no answers. He had been given another chance. But would it last? The game had only just begun. The man staggered backward, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The weight of the gun pressed against his skin had felt real, almost too real. Yet somehow he was still standing.
Alive.
But for how long? He glanced around the dark alley, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure who had held him at gunpoint was gone, vanished into the shadows. The man wasn't sure what to make of it. Had they spared him out of some twisted mercy? Or was this just another move in the game? His breath came in shallow bursts as he forced himself to think. The figure's words echoed in his mind. You're not worth killing yet. The coldness of it sent a shiver through him. Was it a warning? A promise? He couldn't stay here, in the alley, paralyzed by fear. He had come too far. He had to keep going. He had to find out the truth about his son's death. He turned and walked quickly down the alley, his mind focused on the only thing that mattered now: answers. The sound of his footsteps seemed to echo louder in the silence. He passed the empty streets, each step carrying him deeper into the labyrinth of uncertainty. It felt like every shadow was watching him, following him, waiting for him to make a mistake. His phone buzzed in his pocket again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He pulled it out, the screen lighting up with a message. It was from Max. Asterisk, they know you're still alive. Asterisk. The words hit him like a punch. He had to be careful. Max's warning hung in the air, like an ominous storm cloud ready to break. The man quickly typed back. Asterisk, what do they want? Asterisk. Max's reply was almost immediate. Asterisk, they don't want anything. They just don't want you to find out what really happened. Asterisk. The man's blood ran cold. He could feel the walls closing in again. It was like a game of cat and mouse. But this time, he wasn't the one running. He was the one hunting. And whoever was behind his son's death, whoever was pulling the strings, was going to pay. The truth was out there, just beyond his reach. He could almost taste it. But every step he took seemed to push it further away. He couldn't stop now. The stakes were too high. He would not let his son's death be in vain. The man's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a single line of text. Asterisk, don't trust Max. Asterisk. His eyes widened. The message was clear, but it made everything more complicated. Who could he trust now? Max? The mysterious figure? Could he trust anyone at all? His mind spun as he walked faster, every step carrying him deeper into the unknown. The game had changed, and now, more than ever, he was playing by their rules. But he would not stop. He couldn't.
Not now.
Not when the truth was so close. The man stood still, his phone still gripped tightly in his hand. Max's warning rang in his ears. Don't trust Max. He stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, trying to process it. Who could he trust now? His mind churned with suspicion, doubt, and a growing realization that he was completely alone in this. Everything had been a lie. Even the people he thought he could rely on were now tainted, their motives unclear. It was as if the walls were closing in on him, tightening with each passing second. He had come so far, uncovered so much. But now, standing in the middle of the empty street, he wondered if the truth was worth it. Was the cost too high? Could he live with the truth, knowing what it would mean for his son's memory? A cold wind blew through the city, cutting through the silence. His body was trembling, but not from the cold, from the weight of everything he had learned, and the darkness closing in. He couldn't back down now. He had made a promise to his son, and no matter the consequences, he would keep it. He couldn't let the people who took his son's life go free. They had played him, manipulated him, used him as a pawn in their game. But now he was taking control. He wasn't going to let them win. The man took a deep breath and looked up at the city, the skyline before him a jagged outline against the night sky. It had all led to this moment. And despite the fear gnawing at him, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done yet. The game had changed, but so had he. The man turned and walked away, his step steady now. Every part of him was focused on the task ahead. He wasn't just searching for answers anymore. He was hunting down the people who had torn his world apart. And this time there would be no turning back. As he disappeared into the shadows, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. But he was ready. He would never stop until justice was served.